It's clearly raining outside to have this many people here.
Thank you for coming to the meeting despite this weather. I'm Hale Esfandiari, the director of the Middle East program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. It's a great pleasure to have with us today Ambassador Greg Schulte, the U.S. Permanent Representative to the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna. This meeting is co-sponsored by the Middle East program, the Non-Proliferation Forum, which is the Los Alamos National Laboratory, and the Division of International Security Studies at the Wilson Center. I would like to thank my colleague Michael Adler at the Wilson Center, who invited on our behalf the ambassador to come to the center and talk today. The meeting today will be chaired by Joe Pilat, who is a senior advisor in the Director's Office of Los Alamos National Lab. He served as representative of the Secretary of Defense to the 4th Review Conference of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and as an advisor to the U.S. delegation at the 1995 NPT meeting. He's the author of a number of books and articles. Among his books are The Rise of the Great Movement, The Non-Proliferation Predicament, 1995, Atoms for Peace and Analysis After 30 Years, and his last book is An Atom for Peace, A Future After 50 Years, 2007. The ambassador will speak for maybe 20-25 minutes, and we'll open the floor to questions. Joe, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hala. There's a lot of discussion now about a nuclear renaissance, massive growth in nuclear power that recalls some of the expectations of the 1970s. As was the case then, there has been some concern about the proliferation and terrorism risks that might emerge, and whether or not those risks may jeopardize the possibilities for such a nuclear renaissance. I think that it's clear that the atom is a dual nature, civil and military, and that was recognized from the beginnings of the nuclear age. But there have been efforts as well to harness the atom to minimize the military consequences of civilian activities, and the International Atomic Energy Agency has been at the heart of it. Among the issues it's addressing today is preparing for the nuclear renaissance, transforming its safeguards to meet the expectations of advanced nuclear power growth, as well as growing proliferation concerns and noncompliance. It is dealing with noncompliance in the case of Iran and other states, and it is dealing with a whole host of other issues, including the efforts it can undertake to detect weaponization, as well as the efforts it might play in nuclear security to combat nuclear terrorism. We are very fortunate today to have someone who is right in the center of the agency's consideration of all of these issues. Ambassador Greg Schulte, as Hala said, he is the permanent representative of the United States to international organizations in Vienna. That is primarily the IAEA in terms of his responsibilities. He has a distinguished governmental career in the United States in the National Security Council, where he served as executive secretary until his appointment to Vienna in 2005. He was also Senior Director for Southeast European Affairs, Principal Director for Requirement Plans and Counterproliferation Policy, a Special Assistant to the President for implementation of the Dayton Peace Accords. Before that, he served in the international staff of NATO in Belgium, where he was Director of the Bosnia Task Force, and simultaneously served as the Director for Nuclear Planning. He worked for the Secretary of Defense in the 80s to the early 90s as the Director for Strategic Forces Policy and Assistant for Theater Nuclear Forces Policy, where I was fortunate to meet him. We could spend the rest of our time talking about his accomplishments, but I think we'd rather hear him speak. Ambassador Schulte.
Thank you. That would be a very boring discussion, actually. But thank you all for coming. And you're probably here because this is an interesting topic, and perhaps also because it's raining outside, so you had to find a place that was dry. But thank you for coming here. I also thank Michael Adler for helping to make the arrangements. Michael and I were in Vienna together when he was with AFP, and Michael had the attribute of knowing more than just about anyone about the Iran nuclear issue, but another important attribute, which is he wouldn't humiliate our ambassadors who knew less about it. And so I had a very good working relationship with him, and thank you for coming. If I could, everyone looks very serious, so let me inject a note of levity about, when you talk about Iran, unfortunately, Iran nuclear is always very serious. So let me tell you a little story about three individuals who were sentenced to be shot in a small country outside of the United States. And one of them was a member of the Wilson Center. One of them was a member of AFP. And the other one was an American ambassador. This country had enough sort of dignity that they actually asked beforehand, what's your last wish before you're shot? And they turned to the member of the Wilson Center, and he said, well, I'd like to publish one last piece on something important but maybe a little archaic. And they said, sure, that's fine, we can let you do that. They turned to the American ambassador, and he said, well, I'd really like to give a speech on, what's the topic of today's presentation? on sort of, nuclear issues, the view from Iran. And they said, okay, we can let you to do it. And then they turned to the reporter from AFP and said, what's your last wish? And he said, I'd like to be shot before the ambassador gives his speech. So I hope you don't feel that way. What is an important subject? I'd like to sort of keep my presentation short because I'd like to have a discussion with you, because I know a lot of you are knowledgeable in your field and I can benefit from your wisdom, and have this be a two-way conversation. I'm here in town for consultations. I'm seeing Secretary Rice this afternoon and Steve Hadley, so I can't tell you what they're going to tell me. But I'm here to talk to them about the next meeting of the IAEA board, which starts the first week of June, and a number of other issues. Iran is again on the agenda of the IAEA board, and we anticipate that our discussions will be informed by yet another report from Mohammed El-Baradei, the Director General of the IAEA, which we expect may be roughly, Friday the 23rd of this month, although as Michael can tell you, sometimes he likes to play with us by surprising us when he actually issues the report. There'll be three items that I will be looking at, and the other members of the Board of Governors will be looking at in the report. We will be looking to see, has Iran provided serious explanations of indications that we and the IAEA have that until recently they were engaged in weapons-related work? And I'll come back to that. Second, we will look to see if Iran is prepared to implement transparency measures, such as the additional protocol, such as something called Code 3.1, which gives the IAEA early information on new nuclear facilities, and any other transparency measures that the IAEA requests to understand their current activities. And third, we will look to see if Iran has suspended those proliferation-sensitive activities, the enrichment of uranium, the production of a heavy water reactor, that have given the international community such concern. And let me come back to that as well. On weaponization, And weaponization means how do you take, and I'm no technical expert. How many nuclear engineers do we have in the room? Any? Okay, we got one. Any physicists? Any physicists? Okay. Well, the good news here is if we threw those two gentlemen out of the room, we probably couldn't build a nuclear weapon. The bad news is if you had enough smart people like those two gentlemen there, and you put them in a room with the necessary material, they probably could. I mean, basic nuclear weapons technology is 60 years old, and the key thing you need to build a weapon is access to either highly enriched uranium or weapons-usable plutonium, and Iran is developing the capability to build either, to produce both. We've been concerned over the last several years because there also have been indications that Iran has looked at how do you take that bomb-making material and fashion it into a weapon. How do you design a device? How do you weaponize it to make it deliverable, like something, for example, like their Shahab-3 missile system? And the IAEA actually first started investigating indications of weaponization in late 2005. We had a national intelligence estimate that came out late last year in which our intelligence community judged with high confidence that Iran had been engaged in covert weaponization activities until just 5 years ago, when our intelligence community assesses that activity stopped, basically because the Iranians were afraid they were going to be caught. What worries us is these weaponization activities, which we judge have been put on the shelf, could be readily taken off the shelf today, at some point in the future, when the uranium enrichment program is sufficiently advanced, and there is absolutely no assurance that the IAEA, which didn't know about those activities at the time, would know if there were a resumption of those activities. Now, in February of this year, we received a briefing by Ali Heinonen, who is the head inspector. Ali Heinonen is a professional. He's Finnish. You don't want to be investigated by Ali Heinonen. He's very good. We take him very seriously, as does everyone else in the Board of Governors. And he gave what was a very serious briefing, but also a very dramatic briefing, in which he talked about some of the information that the IAEA had obtained, some from us, some from other sources, some from its own investigations, on indications that Iran was engaged in design work and even engineering work on weapons design and weaponization. And it was a dramatic briefing. I remember at the end, Ambassador Sultanea, who's the Iranian ambassador, shot up like a Shahab-3, very angry, and said all this is baseless accusations. But Mr. Heinonen, the head of the Safeguards Department, very calmly, carefully explained how all the indications that the IA had amassed, from testing of high explosives in an appropriate configuration for a nuclear weapon, to the development of explosive bridge wires, you probably know what that is, I'm not sure I would recognize one if I saw one, to modification of a reentry vehicle for a Shahab-3 missile. All of this was relevant and consistent with nuclear weapons research and development. And he also pointed out how the interconnections between these activities, the administrative linkages, linked it to the IAEA's mandate and suggested some form of organized program, which is very consistent with our own national intelligence estimate. And he very carefully said that until these activities are explained and until Iran implements measures like the additional protocol, it cannot get a clean bill of health from the IAEA. When Ambassador Sultanea said these are baseless accusations, Mr. Heinonen said, I cannot accept this conclusion without a full understanding of these indications of weaponization activities. Now, a couple of weeks ago, the IAEA and Iran agreed a process to deal with weaponization. In a way, this was maybe an important step forward. We'll see, because Iran was at least addressing this as an issue that had, or was treating this as an issue that had to be addressed. But we're less interested in process and more interested in results. And the results we want to see, which we hope the IAEA will be able to bring back to us in the DG's report when we meet in early June, the results we're looking for is a credible Iranian explanation of these activities, plus assurances that they will allow the IAEA inspectors to verify that they're halted. Now, why is this important? Is this just a matter of history, what they were doing in our judgment until 5 years ago? This is not just of historical interest. This is very much of current and future interest. Because what we're talking about here is a lack of international confidence in the peaceful nature of Iran's program. And if they were conducting weaponization activities, as we believe, until just 5 years ago, they need to acknowledge that. And they also need to give confidence that those activities have stopped. Because as I said, we're worried that they could resume, and if the IAEA doesn't understand those activities, it's less likely to be able to detect and therefore, we hope, deter a resumption of those activities. Now, a second thing that we'll be looking for in the report, as I mentioned, was insight into current activities. Something called the additional protocol, which gives IAEA inspectors additional information and access into countries' programs. Something called Code 3.1. Now, whenever I talk about Code 3.1, somebody in the back of the room falls asleep. I don't blame you, and I think he's over there. Anyway, but Code 3.1 of the Safeguards Agreement of Iran basically requires Iran to provide early information on new facilities. By the way, this is Code 3.1 is, we think, what Syria violated by not telling the IAEA about the development of this covert nuclear reactor that they had underway until September of last year. But so we'll be looking, is Iran ready to give full transparency into its current activities? And third, we'll be looking for suspension. Why is suspension important? Suspension of particularly uranium enrichment activities is a requirement first established by the Board of Governors and then mandated, made an international legal requirement by the UN Security Council. And this UN requirement is important, I would submit, for three reasons. First, there is this international lack of confidence in the nature of Iran's program. And it's a lack of confidence compounded by the fact that we believe, and the IAEA has indications, that Iran was engaged in weaponization activities until just recently. And secondly, by the fact that there is no obvious civil requirement for them to enrich uranium. I mean, Iran has one nuclear reactor under construction at Bushehr. The Russians have delivered the necessary fuel. Iran has a contract with Russia which can be extended for the lifetime of the reactor, which would provide fuel for the lifetime of the reactor. Countries like South Korea, which has a very advanced nuclear program, it has 20 nuclear reactors. It's planning to build 6 more. It gets 30% of its electricity from nuclear power. They don't enrich uranium. It doesn't make sense economically. They've chosen to rely on the international market, which is very diverse and very competitive. So why has Iran chosen to move ahead with uranium enrichment, claiming it's for reactors when they don't have any reactors they need the uranium for? As the Russian governor said at a board meeting a number of months ago, this doesn't make any civil sense. So first, I mean, suspension is important to start regaining confidence. Secondly, suspension is important because what we believe Iran is doing is they're trying to master the technology to enrich uranium. Now, this is a technology that other countries have mastered. We don't think Iran is still quite there. The last briefing we had from the IAEA indicated that their first-generation centrifuges, which are machines you spin at a high rate of speed to enrich uranium, were operating only at about 20% of capacity, and they're trying to develop new generations of centrifuges. Quite frankly, we don't want them to master that technology, which they don't need for civil purposes, because our concern, shared by others, is they would then replicate those same centrifuges at a covert facility and then have the option to produce material for a bomb. The third reason why we think that suspension is important is because we're prepared to negotiate with them But we want them to suspend uranium enrichment first because we need a sign of goodwill from them. We need to know that they're ready to negotiate seriously, and they don't plan to repeat a ploy which we've seen before, and in fact they've even bragged about, of using negotiations to provide political cover to continue with their program. Unfortunately, the prognosis for a positive report from the Director General on this issue is not particularly good. As you know, President Ahmadinejad just last month on Nuclear Technology Day, which as far as I can tell is a holiday he personally invented, he announced that not only was Iran going to continue operating their first-generation centrifuges, but that they were going to add anywhere from 3,000 to 6,000 more. And he also announced what we knew, and that's that they're working on additional generations. Now, we think that sometime President Ahmadinejad overstates the actual capability they have. A year ago, on the same anniversary, he announced industrial-scale enrichment, but it wasn't until 6 months later that the IAEA inspectors told us that they actually had 3,000 centrifuges up and running, and as you heard, we think they're still not running them at full capacity. But even if it's going to take them a little bit of time to add an additional 3,000 or 6,000 or to perfect new generations of centrifuges, two things are clear. First, President Ahmadinejad has ignored sort of international concerns about Iran's program. And secondly, he's quite prepared, as is the rest of the leadership, to ignore the various Security Council resolutions that require Iran to suspend these activities. Now, what we do in Vienna at the IAEA, the technical verification work we perform there is a critical part of a larger dual-track strategy being pursued by the P5+1. The U.S., our European three colleagues, Russia and China, in conjunction with support from the European Union and a lot of other countries across the world. We recently reinforced the two tracks of that strategy, first the sanctions track by adopting Resolution 1803, and secondly the negotiating track with an updating of the June 2006 offer, which is now being transmitted to Iran, which I won't be in a position to talk about in detail because we've chosen to do this privately at this point in time. But one thing is clear to me from where I sit is that we are dealing with a regime that is very determined. They have made, even though there is no obvious near-term requirement for uranium enrichment, they have made this an issue of national pride and perhaps even regime legitimacy. And so convincing them through our dual-track strategy to take a different approach is going to be tough. But I think the best we can do if we want to be successful in getting a diplomatic solution, which is our goal, is to sustain the strategy, make it clear there are two paths open to them, the path of confrontation that we've repeatedly heard, or the path of negotiation, if only they suspend these activities they don't need for civil purposes. Thank you for your attention. I'm very interested in taking your questions or hearing your thoughts about how I can do my job better or how the U.S. government can be more successful with our allies in pursuing this.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Yes. Please identify yourself and your institution.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. My name is Vladimir Karamorza. I'm with Russian television, RTVI. Last week, Russia officially joined the third round of sanctions. That was one of President Putin's last decrees as president. And so how do you assess this fact? And would you describe Russia's position as more helpful or more unhelpful in terms of pressure, applying pressure on Iran? And do you expect any change with a change of administration, a change in Iranian policy? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Russia is a key partner for all of this. You know, in the case of in the case of Iran and the case of North Korea, very different situations, slightly different strategies, but one thing is in common. In each case, we're pursuing a negotiated outcome with partners. Russia is involved in both of those discussions. And quite frankly, I believe on DPRK, I believe China is the most important partner. Anyone from China here from the embassy? But on Iran, I believe Russia is the most important partner. And there, I know that, from talking to my Russian colleague, it's clear to me that Russia shares the same concerns that we do about Iran's program. The same questions about the peaceful nature. I mentioned to you before the Russian governor sort of saying to the Board of Governors, there's no civil reason for this. And Russia has been active as part of the P5+1 process in putting forward potential solutions. I mean, after all, one of the offers, or one part of the June 2006 offer, is for Iran to participate in an international enrichment center that Russia is operating at a place called Angarsk. We would like Iran to take up that offer, or to consider it, or other offers that are on the table too. So Russia is a good partner with ours. Now, I can't fool you. I mean, there have been times when there have been differences, between our countries, off and on, in terms of the timing of resolutions or the content of resolutions. Being Americans, we're sort of eager to move a little bit faster and with a little bit more vigor. But I have to say, at the strategic level, in terms of our overall objectives and in terms of the overall approach, there has been good agreement. And I've worked on, sort of in my career, a lot of different international issues. And despite differences from time to time, the amount of consensus I see here between U.S., Europe, Russia, and China is actually quite astounding. And it's the one thing that gives me some hope that perhaps we can be successful.
Yes, Laura.
Ambassador.
Hey, Laura, how are you?
Oh, right here. I want to pose an optimistic hypothetical that we find ourselves maybe a couple years down the road. The Iranians have answered the questions that are being posed in the context of the IAEA reports. The negotiations have concluded in some way that both sides can live with. It'll be a compromise. We won't get everything we want out of that probably, and they wouldn't either. But you're going to find we're in some future in which the Iranians have some nuclear activities going on at Bushehr, at least, and maybe there's some others that have been identified as being acceptable. Does the IAEA as an institution or the NPT as a treaty give a basis for that kind of extra level of scrutiny that you would want to apply to a country that has in fact broken its commitments? Even though it may have come clean on those commitments, it may have answered questions. We put people in jail for a crime and they come out and they're still on parole, or they still have an ankle bracelet. What's the NPT equivalent of that kind of parole phase as Iran moves back, or what is the process by which they might move back into a completely trustworthy context?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Laura. I mean, first thing I should say is, our concern, as you know, is about Iran's pursuit of uranium enrichment capabilities or capabilities that would allow it to produce plutonium. These are activities that, in our mind, don't have any clear civil purpose at this point. We have once upon a time, the U.S. government had problems with Bushehr. We were concerned about some of the technology transfers we were concerned it could provide a cover for proliferation. At this point, we've come to the conclusion, in cooperation with our Russian friends, that no, Bushehr is fine. In fact, in many ways, Bushehr provides a model for how Iran can get access to civil nuclear technology, to electricity from nuclear power, without the same proliferation concerns associated with developing a uranium enrichment capability. Because Russia will provide the fuel, and Russia will take back the fuel, which is what most countries in the world do if they have nuclear energy. So we can easily see any type of outcome with Iran involving Bushehr or future Bushehrs. In fact, the June 2006 offer, which we've just updated and are getting ready to present, specifically offers access to state-of-the-art Western technology to build light water reactors to meet legitimate energy needs. Now, does the NPT or IAEA have sort of rules for violators, or rules for countries that have where international confidence has been lost? I'm not sure it does. I'm willing to be corrected on that. But I think part of the process, though, is that Iran needs to reestablish international confidence. And in fact, the Security Council resolutions talk about that. I mean, they talk about how Iran needs to restore international confidence with the IAEA and with the UN Security Council. And to do that, I could imagine easily either the IAEA or the P5+6 asking for additional measures to restore that confidence, asking for additional transparency measures that go beyond the additional protocol to understand what Iran is doing today, to get a greater insight into their weaponization activities, which is an area usually not covered by the IAEA, but which in this case has been getting special focus. And it may take a certain amount of time before international confidence can be restored. But I think that's a matter for Dr. El-Baradei and the IAEA board as they think about a renewed safeguards regime, and that's also an issue for the P5+1 to consider.
Ed.
Edward Levine, Senate Foreign Relations Committee. You mentioned a couple of times Iran's additional protocol. There's another additional protocol of interest, and that's the United States additional protocol. It's 16 months since Congress enacted implementing legislation for that additional protocol, and still the administration seems almost imperceptibly near to being able to submit instruments of ratification, despite the pious assurances that we get in hearings that it's right around the corner. We got those same assurances a year ago, and they proved to be false. Is this a problem for you, or doesn't it come up in your diplomacy? And the second question, you spoke of the need for a credible presentation by Iran with regard to the allegations of weaponization. Looking back to the past DG's report, does the United States find Iran's explanation of other matters to be credible or not?
Well, first off, Edward, thank you. On the additional protocol, we would like that to go into force for the United States. And we thank you for the role you've played in helping to bring us there. I know that, that talking to people in Washington, the goal is to get that thing implemented ideally this year. I mean, that's the goal. And my sense is that people are taking that seriously and looking what needs to be done to have that happen. I actually don't find that a major impediment, but on the other hand, I think it is important to talk about how many countries in the world have signed the additional protocol, as we have, but also how many countries are implementing the additional protocol, which I think is an important measure. So we thank you for your help. And I think I don't want to give you another empty promise, but my understanding is we're working on it, and I'm encouraging it from where I sit. You mentioned the previous information provided by Iran on its past activities. The IAEA Secretariat in Iran agreed to something called a work plan, which you're familiar with, which was meant to resolve a lot of these outstanding activities. I was not shy. I should point out I'm not a professional diplomat, and I'm still very much in the learning phase, so all advice is taken. And I was not shy in saying, we didn't like this work plan. I mean, what it effectively did, it played into Iran's agenda of pushing off answers to questions, making closure of one, a prerequisite to moving on to the next, and so forth. And Iran was clearly trying to take attention away from what's the greatest concern for us, which is their continued development of an enrichment capability. The irony is maybe in the end the work plan was a little bit of a trap for Iran, because now they have to address weaponization, something I think they hoped they wouldn't have to address. But they did, as a result of the work plan and pressure brought on them, they did provide additional information on past activities, their dealings with the AQCON network in the 80s and 90s. Now, this information, the IAEA was very careful. It never closed these issues. Occasionally, it said the information provided was not inconsistent with their findings, not a real strong judgment. And the IAEA has made it clear that the information that was provided has not been verified, still needs to be verified before Iran gets sort of, a stamp of approval, and that these issues can be reopened if the discussion of weaponization requires them to be reopened. So, we don't talk a lot about those other previously outstanding issues, but they're still there, and there's still some serious questions that Iran hasn't addressed on those.
We had a question in the corner here. Yes.
Hi, Miles Pomper from Arms Control Today. Two questions. One is, in terms of the P5+1 presentation of the offer, my understanding is that all the representatives of all the countries but the United States will be presenting an offer. Can you explain why we have chosen not to be one of the parties that's actually presenting an offer directly to the Iranians? And secondly, the first question alluded in some measure to the 123 agreement that was recently signed between the United States and Russia. And as you know, a lot of people on the Hill are skeptical of the wisdom of approving this agreement, particularly at this time, given the perception that Russia is not doing enough on Iran. How would you respond to that criticism?
Thank you, Miles. Well, first, I'm going to give you an answer to your first question that Michael Adler was used to in Vienna. I don't have anything for you on that. I'm not in a position to talk about the updated offer or how we're rolling it out. On the 123 agreement with Russia, I hope that goes into effect, and I can tell you why from my perspective. Is our colleague from Russian TV here still, or is he gone? No, okay. I mean, there are issues today, no surprise, on which there are differences between the U.S. and Russia, and we're looking where we can to bridge those differences, and sometimes we know we just have to live with them. But on most of the issues that I work with, on 99% of the issues that I work with, whether it's nuclear terrorism, it's reliable access to nuclear fuel, it's Iran, or it's North Korea, the U.S. and Russia are pretty darn close to each other. We have the joint initiative from President Putin and President Bush, which came out from Kennebunkport, talking about how do our countries work together to make sure that countries looking at nuclear power do it in a responsible way. We've supported their international enrichment project at Angarsk that I mentioned. They've supported and become full members in our global nuclear energy partnership. And I think the 123 agreement is important such that we can continue that type of cooperation. I think it would also send an important symbol, a political signal, too. We have 123 agreements with countries across the world. We have 123 agreements with countries like China, for example. Why don't we have one with Russia? And so I hope that we'll be able to put one into place. Thank you.
Yes, here.
Kasım Cindemir with Turkish Daily Hürriyet. Sir, you visited Turkey recently. What was the purpose of that visit, and what would you like to see from Turkey regarding this nuclear issue with Iran?
Thank you. I did have the opportunity to go to Ankara recently. I always love going to Turkey because when I was in NATO, I worked very closely with the Turkish government, and those consultations are important. I was there because Turkey is a neighbor with Iran, which gives you special concerns. It also gives you special insights. You also have an important role in implementing Resolution 1803 and the various other Security Council resolutions. And I was there to consult with your government to understand their concerns and also to get their insights. How best do we deal with the Iranian nuclear issue? And I have to say that when I talked about the dual-track strategy with members of your government, that we were essentially in accord on how we had to work together to get Iran into negotiations, but also to demonstrate to it through implementation of Security Council resolutions that if it wasn't prepared to negotiate, there was a very different future in front of it.
Yes, here.
Shala Araste, VOA, Voice of America. The Islamic Republic has said that they have no intention of stopping their nuclear activities, and they are still rejecting the suspension of their enrichment uranium. Are you still expecting that they change their mind? And if not, what's going to be there? Another round of sanctions?
First off, let me just express my own personal disappointment. About 2 weekends ago, I was supposed to run the Salzburg Marathon, and Voice of America was going to run with me. Voice of America, Persian TV was going to come with me, and I was trying to think of a catchy motto, something like "Iran with Iran," although it wasn't clear to me that would work in Persian. And so, anyway, I'm hoping maybe in the Wachau Marathon. I didn't run because I messed up my ankle. I'm hoping it'll be working for the Wachau Marathon. So maybe I'll run with your listeners then. But we saw the initial reports, which were characterized as Iran's leaders rejecting this updated offer before they even saw it. Well, we're not accepting that. I mean, we hope that they will look at it very seriously. We hope that they will think that the choices are before them. We hope that they will think about how to get into these negotiations so that they can benefit from civil nuclear power while at the same time assuring the rest of the world that their intentions are purely peaceful. So I don't know how to characterize that, the initial sounds that we heard coming from the government in Iran. We're not accepting it as a no. We want to see, are they ready to negotiate? But at the same time, I think the leaders have to understand, if they turn down opportunity after opportunity, I mean, what they're going to find themselves is, increasingly subject to Security Council resolutions, to international isolation, so they shouldn't turn down those opportunities.
May I ask one more question? Islamic Republic have proposed of a package of their own, which includes security and many other issues. Is the U.S. prepared to negotiate?
I have yet to see that package. They've been talking a lot about it. I don't know if it's actually been presented anywhere. But I hope, in presenting any package, I hope it's something serious. I hope they haven't just, I could very easily write for Iran a package that wasn't serious. We've seen ones like that before. I hope the package isn't just being put together for propaganda purposes. I hope that the package is something where they're reflecting international concerns.
Thank you.
Yes, in the corner.
Me? Hi. Mike Kellerman, APTVS Television. If the IAEA and the NIE determine that the Iranians do not have an active nuclear weapons program now, why is the United States, which you represent, continuing to press for sanctions against Iran? And also, what are you going to talk to Rice about today, please?
Good try on the second one there. First off, a lot of people, unfortunately, misread the National Intelligence Estimate. A lot of people did it accidentally. Some people, unfortunately, did it on purpose. Too many people read the first half sentence and stopped. But you had to read the footnote. You had to read the whole thing in context. And what you recognized from reading that is that we were right to be concerned about Iran's nuclear program, and we remain right to be concerned. I mean, the NIA does tell us that, in the judgment of our intelligence community, Iran halted specific weapons design and weaponization projects in late 2003. They did that, in our judgment, because they were afraid of being caught. But remember what's happened since. They also suspended uranium enrichment at the same time when that was revealed. That they suspended publicly. And after a period of time, despite international scrutiny, despite international pressure, they resumed those activities. So our concern is that, first, Iran could resume this specific weapons-related work, and the IAEA might not even catch it. And secondly, that in the meantime, Iran is developing the wherewithal to produce material for a nuclear weapon that could then subsequently be weaponized. So we're right to remain concerned, and we are still concerned about their activities.
Yes, right here.
Thank you. Howard Moreland, a private citizen. Iran is surrounded by nuclear weapons in Russia and Pakistan, but there are two arsenals that Iran might consider to be particular threats aimed at them: the Israeli nuclear arsenal and U.S. nuclear weapons stationed in Turkey. What role do these weapons play in the overall picture?
Well, first, we support, if you talk about Israel, we share the vision of many countries about a Middle East free of weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear weapons. But I think we're very realistic when we look at that vision. And there are two hurdles to achieving that. The first is compliance with existing commitments. And Iran has failed to, has violated the NPT agreement, and it's abused it. And as long as Iran is pursuing the wherewithal to produce nuclear weapons, I am more worried that we'll see a nuclear arms race in the Middle East rather than a nuclear weapons-free zone. Secondly, I think we have to be conscious that if we're going to achieve a Middle East free of nuclear weapons, to include Israel, that we're going to have something that looks like a comprehensive peace settlement that leaves countries feeling secure within their own borders. And at the core of that has to be some type of agreement that Secretary Rice is working on very hard right now between Israel and Palestine. And here another hurdle, unfortunately, is Iran, a country that doesn't share that vision, whose leadership has called for one of those entities to be eliminated, which has actively opposed the Middle East peace process. So I think we need to deal with Iran, as the Security Council itself acknowledged, if we're going to be having success in dealing with some of the other nuclear issues in the region. Wait a minute. I didn't know that Michael got to ask me a question. Better be a softball for once, Michael.
Just a question. The key issue here seems to be the Iranians' refusal to suspend uranium enrichment. And is that really a totally inflexible U.S. demand, or could some sort of formula be found where they froze enrichment at current levels, and that could be a way of getting into talks?
Well, the requirement for suspension isn't a U.S. requirement. It's actually a requirement first established by the board and then mandated by the Security Council. Now, there are a lot of ways you can look at getting into talks, but we've made it very clear we're not prepared to join those talks until the IAEA is able to verify a full suspension of those activities. Now, full suspension doesn't mean termination. It doesn't mean blowing up these facilities. It means what it is. It means suspension until we can negotiate mechanisms that would provide the international community confidence in the nature of their activities. And suspension is important. A lot of people say, well, why has the U.S. created and others created this precondition? Well, I would actually argue that Iran has created a precondition. They want us to recognize their violation of Security Council resolutions before they begin negotiations. And again, we think suspension is important because they don't need it for civil purposes, but it will help them to master the uranium enrichment, but it will help them to master the technology to build bombs, and they need to rebuild confidence. And then finally, we don't want to be taken for a ride whereby, they continue to work on their program and negotiate.
But is there a way of easing in to that? For instance, the Europeans would first negotiate a freeze, and then the United States would come when there was a full suspension?
Oh, I don't want to talk about the details of the negotiations, other than to say I think that if the Iranians were prepared to negotiate seriously and were prepared to do a freeze, we could help them get there if they're ready to make that decision.
Yes. Back here.
Hi, Stephanie Faber from Iran VNC. An IAEA delegation, I believe.
From Iran what?
Visual News Corps.
Ah, okay.
We're new.
You'll have to tell me later what that is.
Sure.
Okay.
Anyway, an IAEA delegation is in Tehran today, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
What do you hope to come of this? And also, will there be any more high-level IAEA officials heading to Iran before al-Baghdadi gives his final report?
Not that I know of. But, I think what has happened as part of this process that I described to you is that the IAEA has given access to a lot of the information it has on weaponization. It's given access to Iran. And they are now waiting for Iran's response, for Iran's explanations. And their purpose in being there in part is to work with Iran on understanding what their past activities are. Now, as I said before, if all they do is they come back and they say this is baseless accusations, that's not going to be an answer that's going to satisfy either us or the IAEA inspectors or most other members of the board. So we're looking for very serious explanations of these activities and not just further stonewalling.
Mm-hmm. Holly, would you like to ask a question?
You told us a lot about what the United States and the Europeans and the IAEA has been asking Iran to do. When the Iranians sit to negotiate, what do they want? What is their demand?
Well, I don't sit down with Iranians to
you,
negotiate.
But you get the reports.
And so
from Solana and from the
and so what I have to do, and I do get the reports and so forth. And I used to work for Javier Solana when I was at NATO. He's an impressive gentleman. But what I try to do occasionally, and perhaps some of you can help me, is to try to put myself in the minds of the Iranian leadership. I mean, why are they so determined to pursue these technologies that they don't need for civil purposes and only put them under sanctions? And here's the best I've been able to do as a non-expert on Iran. Perhaps they want it for national prestige. As you point out, there are other countries in the region with nuclear weapons. Maybe they feel that Iran, as a great nation, deserves that. Perhaps they're pursuing it for the legitimacy of the regime, that they see this as a good nationalist issue that they can use to cement their hold on power at home, at the same time that the economy, despite the price of oil, is not doing particularly well. Perhaps they see this as a way to provide for Iran's national security, because they look in the neighborhood and they live in a dangerous neighborhood. Perhaps they see this as a way to get access to advanced technology. So the challenge for diplomacy, and it's not an easy one, but the challenge for diplomacy, if that's right, is to convince the leaders in Iran that if they want prestige, the way to get prestige isn't to sort of, become a new North Korea, potentially nuclear armed, but completely isolated. I mean, the way for prestige is to sit down at a negotiating table with the world's powers, with the P5+1 in Germany. And Secretary Rice has made it clear she's ready to join those negotiations if only they suspend these activities they don't need for civil purposes. We need to convince them, if their goal is to stay into power, that that they should be looking at what's in the interest, of the people of Iran. They should recognize that Secretary Rice isn't demanding to sit down with some new regime. She's saying she's ready to deal with the current leadership. If their goal is national security, we need to convince them that a nuclear arms race is not in their interest. It's perhaps more dangerous to them than to other countries in the region, and that the offer that's on the table that's just been updated includes mechanisms to consult on regional security interests. And if their goal is access to advanced technology, we should convince them that the best way to advance technology isn't through sort of isolation, taking 1970s technologies that they stole from Pakistan and trying to update it. The route to advanced technology in this globalized world is through cooperation, and again through the offer that's on the table that offers them access to state-of-the-art technology. So I can't tell you exactly what the Iranian concerns are, but I can hypothesize maybe that's what they're interested in, and then the challenge for diplomacy is to convince them there's a much better route to get there.
Thank you. We are unfortunately out of time. I think you might all agree with me